They called her the poorest girl in the department. They invited her to the party as a joke. She arrived as the Korean Mafia's wife. And every single person in that room who had ever laughed at her name, mocked her second-hand shoes, or whispered about her scholarship status stood frozen, watching the most dangerous man in Seoul rest his hand on the small of her back like she was the only solid thing in his world. She looked at none of them. She only looked at him. And something in the room shifted forever. Welcome. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell me why you clicked this video. Her name was Nia Osei, and she had learned early that the world sorted people into two categories: those who were noticed and those who were useful. At Hanguk University's prestigious business department, Nia had spent 3 years firmly in the second category. She was the girl who tutored the students whose parents paid her tuition. She was the one who knew exactly which library corner stayed warm past midnight, which vending machine gave 2 bags of chips for the price of 1, and which professors graded on effort when the semester grades looked brutal. She was smart in the way that people who cannot afford to fail are always smart. Thoroughly, quietly, desperately. She was also, though she would have been the last person to claim it, breathtaking. Tall, with deep brown skin that caught light the way velvet catches it, and eyes that held something steady and ancient, like she had decided long ago not to be broken by anything this world tried. Her natural hair sat in a thick, dark crown above her face, and her curves filled out her second-hand blazer in a way that made the expensive girls in her cohort pull their designer jackets a little tighter. Not because they were cold. Because something about Nia Osei made women instinctively aware of their own presentation. She did not know this about herself. That was perhaps the most devastating thing about her. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under her dormitory door in an envelope that smelled faintly of expensive perfume. It was printed on heavy cream cardstock. The department's end-of-semester celebration. A rooftop party at the Celestial Hotel, one of Seoul's most exclusive venues. Dress code, formal. RSVP required. And at the bottom, handwritten in looping ink that belonged to her classmate Park Hye-won, a single line that Nia did not understand the cruelty of until much later. We thought you should come this year. Would be interesting. She almost did not go. She spent 20 minutes on the phone with her older sister back in Accra, weighing it out loud. Her sister told her to go. Her sister said, "Wear something beautiful and let them see you." Her sister, who had never owned anything designer in her life, said this with the authority of someone who understood that beauty was not about fabric but about carriage. Nia found the dress at a second-hand shop 2 streets from campus. Navy blue, fitted, with a neckline that swept wide across her collarbones and a skirt that moved when she walked. It cost 12,000 won. She wore gold earrings that had been her mother's. She borrowed heels from the girl across the hall, who was 2 sizes bigger but whose shoes she could stuff with tissue. She did her own hair and her own makeup, and when she looked in the mirror she did not look expensive. She looked like herself, fully and without apology. That was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The Celestial Hotel rooftop was wrapped in string lights and money. Nia stepped out of the elevator and felt the shift immediately, the way the air in a room changes when everyone in it is performing something. Wealth performed. Status performed. Even joy was performed here, measured and calibrated and designed to be witnessed. She recognized her classmates in their best clothes, the ones whose parents owned the companies that the university prepared other students to work for. She saw Hye-won across the room, already watching her with the sharp satisfaction of someone waiting for a reaction. Nia gave her nothing. She smiled, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and moved toward the railing to look at the city. That was when she heard his voice. Not what he said. She did not hear the words. She heard the register of it, low and even, carrying through the ambient noise the way a cello note carries through an orchestra. She turned without meaning to, because her body made the decision before her mind caught up, and that was when she first saw Kang Min-ho. He was standing at the far end of the rooftop, slightly apart from the cluster of hotel management and department faculty who had gathered around him with the particular energy of people who want something from someone more powerful than themselves. He was tall, dressed in black from collar to shoe with the kind of simplicity that only very expensive things can achieve. His face was angular, precise, the kind of face that photographers describe as severe until you see the mouth, which held just enough softness to make the rest of it devastating. He had the stillness of a man who had never needed to fill silence with performance. He was looking at the city. And then, as if she had pulled on some invisible thread between them, he turned and looked directly at her. Nia looked away first. She was not intimidated. She simply had no framework for what had just happened inside her chest, and she needed a moment to classify it before she could function normally again. She did not get that moment. Hye-won appeared at her elbow, flushed with excitement and something else that Nia would identify later as the particular glee of a person whose joke is about to land. "There you are. I'm so glad you came. This is going to be a night to remember, believe me." She was already looking past Nia, toward the faculty table, toward whatever she thought was about to happen. "I should mention," she added, voice dropping into performed concern, "that the seating arrangement put you at table 9. Near the back. I hope that's okay. We didn't have many options." Nia looked at her steadily. "That's fine. Thank you for the invitation." Haiwan blinked. She had expected something different. Embarrassment, maybe. Gratitude that was just thin enough to feel like humiliation. She had not expected calm. She recovered quickly, smiled, and floated away toward more interesting territory. Nia turned back to the railing. The city glittered below her. She had grown up in a city that glittered differently, warmer, more chaotic, more alive. She thought of her mother sometimes when she looked at city lights. Her mother had loved light. She was still at the railing when a voice said, just to her left, "You looked like you wanted to be anywhere else. And then you looked like you decided not to be." She turned. Kang Min-ho was standing close enough that she should have heard him approach, but she had not. Up close he was different from across a rooftop. Up close there were small things. A faint scar along his left jaw, the way he held his glass with 2 fingers, the particular quality of his attention, which was complete and unperformed and slightly unnerving because of it. Nia held his gaze. "I made a decision," she said. "That's different from wanting." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile and somehow more significant. He said Kang Min-ho. Like it was just a name. Like it was not attached to everything it was attached to. "Neo-se," she said. Like hers was the same. They talked for 47 minutes. She knew the exact duration because the city clocks chimed once at the beginning and twice at the end, and she counted both sounds with the part of her brain that was still running calculations while the rest of her was fully, helplessly present in a conversation that felt unlike any she had ever had. He asked about her actual thoughts. Not what she was studying or where she was from or what her parents did. He asked what she thought about the way cities organized grief, about whether efficiency was a moral value or just an economic one, about what she would change about how people were taught to think. He listened to her answers the way people listen to music they are hearing for the first time and already know they will return to. She did not ask him what he did. She did not ask him anything, she realized later. She had been so busy being listened to that she had forgotten to be curious in return. That was the first sign, though she did not read it yet, that something unusual was happening. He excused himself when one of the suited men at the far end of the roof made a subtle gesture. He said, "I'll find you again," in the same tone he might say, "The sun will rise," and walked away before she could respond. Nia stood at the railing for another minute, blinking at the city. Haiwan found her 20 minutes later with an expression so complicated it required its own paragraph to decode. There was jealousy in it, and confusion, and a recalculated assessment that Nia recognized from the faces of people who have just realized they miscounted something important. "Do you know who that was?" Haiwan asked. She was trying to sound casual and failing. "A man named Min-ho," Nia said. "We talked." Haiwan stared at her. "Kang Min-ho." "Kang." She said the surname like it was a building she was gesturing toward. "His family runs half the port operations in Incheon. He sits on the board of 3 of the largest private equity firms in Korea." She lowered her voice. "There are other things people say about his family. Older things. Bigger things." She looked at Nia with the urgent intensity of someone who wanted to land a point. "He is not someone you just talk to at a rooftop party." Nia considered this. Then she considered the 47 minutes. And she said, "Apparently he is." She left the party at 10:30. She took the bus home because the heels were beginning to disagree with her feet and she refused to spend money on a taxi for a party she had been invited to as a joke. She did not know, because she could not see it, that a black car followed the bus at a careful distance all the way to her stop, and did not turn around until she was safely inside her building. That was the first thing he did for her. She would not find out about it for months. The next morning, Nia sat in her 8 a.m. macroeconomics lecture with dark circles under her eyes and 3 cups of instant coffee replacing the sleep she had not gotten. She had lain awake thinking about a conversation in a way that embarrassed her in the daylight. She was practical. She was focused. She did not lie awake thinking about men she had spoken to for 47 minutes at parties she had been invited to as entertainment. She opened her laptop and started her notes. By the end of the week, she had mostly convinced herself it was nothing. Then the flowers arrived. They came to the department office on a Thursday afternoon, a vase of proteas, dark pink and architectural and completely wrong for the aesthetic of a university administrative office. The department secretary looked at them with the expression of someone encountering a word in a language they have not started studying yet. There for Nia Osei, she said to the room in general, as if naming the recipient might help someone explain the situation. Nia received this information in the hallway outside her seminar room, relayed by a classmate who delivered it with the barely contained energy of someone carrying a social grenade. She went to the office, looked at the flowers, read the card. The card said, in handwriting that was direct and undecorated, "I thought about our conversation. I'm still thinking about it. Kang Min-ho." She stood in the office doorway for a long moment. The secretary watched her with polite intensity. Nia said thank you, picked up the vase, carried it to her study room, and sat down with it in front of her and her macroeconomics notes beside it and tried to understand what was happening. She failed to understand it. She studied anyway. The flowers stayed on her desk for 2 weeks until the petals finally gave up. He did not contact her again immediately. That was, she would realize much later, deliberate. Kang Min-ho had not built the kind of quiet and absolute authority he carried by being impatient. He was a man who understood timing the way architects understand load-bearing walls. You do not rush the foundation. He knew where she was, roughly, because one of the men on his payroll had identified her enrollment at Hanguk University within 12 hours of the party. He knew her scholarship status, her family situation, her academic standing. He had looked at this information the way he looked at most information. Carefully, completely, and then he had set it aside and thought about the 47 minutes instead. About the way she had held eye contact without performing confidence. About the way she had said things that were precise and original and not shaped for his approval. He had been surrounded by people performing for his approval since he was 17 years old. It had made him very good at identifying the absence of the performance. He sent the flowers because he wanted her to know she had been remembered. He gave her space because he wanted her to know he was not going to consume her. Both things were true simultaneously. That was the most honest communication he had managed in years. A few days later, Nia was in the library, deep in a case study analysis that was due the following morning when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, Korean area code, and a message that said, "There is a lecture on behavioral economics at the Seoul Institute tomorrow evening. The presenter's work is directly relevant to your thesis argument in your 3rd chapter. I thought you should know. It starts at 7. She looked at her phone for a full minute. Then she typed back, "How do you know what my thesis argues in chapter 3? The response came in under 60 seconds. "I don't. I know what you believe." The argument followed from that. She stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she closed her laptop, looked at the ceiling, and said quietly to no one in particular, "This is going to be a problem." She went to the lecture. She told herself she was going for the content, which was genuinely relevant, and that was true. It was also true that she wore the navy dress again, the second-hand one, because it was the nicest thing she owned and she was not going to pretend that was a coincidence. He was already there when she arrived, in a seat near the back rather than the front, which surprised her. She would have expected a man like him to occupy the front without thinking about it. She found out later that he sat in the back because he could see everything from the back. Entrances, exits, the whole room. He had sat in the back of every room he entered for 11 years. It was not a habit. It was a discipline. She sat 2 seats away from him. Not beside him. Not across the room. 2 seats, which acknowledged his presence without capitulating to it. He looked at her when she sat down. He did not say anything. He turned back to the presenter. They listened to the same lecture in the same room with 2 empty seats between them, and it was somehow the most charged social experience Nia had had since arriving in Korea. By the end of the hour her jaw ached from the effort of looking at the speaker instead of him. Afterward, in the lobby, he said, "Your instinct about the 3rd variable is right." The presenter missed it. She said, "I know. I was going to raise it in the Q&A but he ran over time." He said, "Next time raise it anyway." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that same complete quality of attention, like she was the only information in the room worth processing. She said, "Kang Min-ho, what exactly is this?" He said, "I'm not certain yet. But I'd like to find out. If you're willing." Nia Osei had survived on her own resources for long enough to be deeply suspicious of things that arrived without clear cost. She looked at this man, this powerful, quiet, dangerous man, and she said, "I don't do borrowed time. If you're going to be in my life, you're going to be in my life. Not a project. Not a curiosity. If you want to find out what this is, you find out properly." Something moved across his face. Not surprise. Something deeper than surprise. Something that looked like recognition, like a door opening in a room he had sealed a long time ago. He said, "Properly. Yes, I can do that." She believed him. That was the second sign. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way most things that matter do. Over the following weeks, Kang Min-ho appeared in Nia's life the way weather appears, not by announcement but by evidence. A message that arrived the morning of her most brutal exam containing 3 key points her professor had emphasized in a lecture she had almost missed due to a work shift. A car that materialized outside her late-night library sessions, available but never insistent, driven by a man named Driver Shin who had the professional grace to pretend he was simply parked and not waiting. A restaurant reservation that appeared on her phone for the day she mentioned, offhand in a conversation about economics, that she had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days because her stipend had been delayed. He did not announce these things. He did not explain them. They simply arrived, and she understood that they were from him the way you understand a signature you have seen enough times to recognize without reading it. She called him about the restaurant. She said, "I can pay for my own meals." He said, "I know that. I made the reservation because I wanted to have dinner with you, not because I thought you couldn't afford it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Fine. But I'm ordering whatever I want." He said, "I would expect nothing else." The restaurant was not the most expensive in Seoul, which she noted. It was specific and chosen. A small place in Mapo that served West African fusion food prepared by a Ghanaian chef who had trained in Seoul for 6 years. When she walked in and smelled groundnut soup, she stopped in the doorway and had to work very hard for 3 seconds to maintain the composure she had decided on for the evening. He was already seated. He watched her recognize the food and did not say anything about the 3 seconds. He said instead, "I asked around for a week to find this. I wasn't sure if the fufu was close enough to what you grew up with." She sat down across from him and said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who pays attention." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "It's the most important one." She learned more about him over that dinner than she had from anything she had read or heard. Not facts, though those emerged too carefully and without drama. She learned the texture of him. She learned that he found genuine humor in unexpected things and allowed himself very small, private expressions of it. She learned that he had a brother he worried about constantly and spoke of rarely. She learned that he had been running his family's operations since he was 23, when his father's health had deteriorated suddenly, and that he had walked into that responsibility the way she had walked into hers at 19, without enough warning and without the luxury of falling apart. He learned that she sent money home every month before she ate. That she had taught herself to cook 6 different Korean dishes because groceries were cheaper than restaurants. That she had cried exactly once since arriving in Seoul on her birthday, alone in the library, and that she was not embarrassed about this but would not have told most people. She told him. That surprised her more than anything that evening. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Driver Shin waited outside with the patience of a man well practiced in waiting. When Nia stood to leave, Minho stood too and walked her out, and at the door of the restaurant on a narrow street in Mapo while the autumn air came down cold around them, he said, "I'd like to do this again. As many times as you'll let me." She looked at him. In the streetlight his face was all those precise angles and that quiet mouth. She thought about the 47 minutes on the rooftop. She thought about the flowers and the lecture and the groundnut soup and the way he had said, the fufu might not be close enough, like it mattered, like getting it right for her mattered. She said Thursday. He said Thursday. She walked to the corner, turned it, and allowed herself exactly one full breath of something that she refused to classify as happiness because it was too early and too dangerous, and she had learned the hard way that the things you name become the things you can lose. By the end of that month they were something. Neither of them had said what, exactly, because both of them were people who understood that naming a thing prematurely can collapse it under its own weight. But they saw each other twice a week with the consistency of people who have quietly reorganized their schedules without discussing it. They talked on the phone on Tuesday and Friday nights. He had been to her study room once and looked at her pinboards and her color-coded thesis notes and her stacked library books with the focused respect of a man looking at serious work, and she had felt seen in a way she was not prepared for. Her classmates noticed. Of course they did. The department was small and the social ecosystem was intricate, and a black scholarship student receiving proteas from a man in a car with government-adjacent plates was not something that passed unobserved. The observations ranged from confused to hostile to desperately curious, and all of them circled Haiwan's table at lunch, where the original invitation had been conceived and where the joke had now thoroughly escaped its context and was running loose in the room doing damage to nobody except the people who had made it. Nia noticed the noticing and said nothing. She was not performing anything for anyone. This was private and real and still knew enough that she was handling it carefully, like something fragile she did not want to disturb with too much attention. Then Kim Dae-young arrived. He was a visiting graduate student from a top-ranked Seoul university, placed in the department for a semester exchange, and he was the specific kind of handsome that made introductions into events. He was also, Nia recognized quickly, genuinely smart, which made him interesting in a way that pure aesthetics did not. He sat next to her in the international business seminar on his first day, not because there were no other seats but because he had assessed the room and chosen deliberately. He said, "You're Nia Ose. I read your published paper on informal economies in sub-Saharan markets. It was the most rigorous thing in the last issue." She looked at him. Most people who mentioned her paper led with where she was from. He had led with the work. She said, "Thank you. You actually read it?" He said, "Twice. I had questions about your methodology in section 4. He pulled out his own notes. She looked at the notes. They were real questions, good ones. They talked for 20 minutes about the methodology. He asked if she wanted to get coffee and continue the conversation. She said yes because it was a genuine academic conversation and she was not going to let anything make her suspicious of a good faith intellectual exchange. She did not mention this coffee to Minho when she spoke to him on Friday. Not because she was hiding it. Because it did not seem significant enough to mention. A coffee between colleagues discussing published work was not a thing she felt required reporting. Minho found out anyway. Not because he was monitoring her, exactly. One of his men saw them at the coffee shop, recognized Nia, and mentioned it with no particular emphasis, because this is what people in his orbit did. They relayed information as a matter of course. He sat with this information for 2 days. He was not naive enough to think that a woman like Nia would be socially isolated just because she was seeing him. He was also not, it turned out, as composed about it as he would have preferred. On Sunday evening he called her and their conversation moved along its normal channels for 20 minutes before he said, with the particular neutrality of a man working very hard to be neutral, "How is the department going? Meeting people?" She said, "Yes. There's a visiting student, Kim Dae-young. He'd read my paper. We had coffee to talk about the methodology." Minho said, "Good." She said nothing for a moment because she could hear something underneath the word good that was not good, that was in fact the opposite of good, struggling to maintain the mask of good. She said, "Minho." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you about to be strange about this?" Pause. Then honestly, possibly. She said, "Dae-young is a colleague. He was interested in the research." He said, "I know." She said, "You don't sound like you know." He said, after another pause that she could feel the weight of through the phone, "You can talk to whoever you want. I'm aware of that. He stopped. He was not accustomed to the sensation of not finishing sentences. He tried again. "I find that I have a strong preference for being the person you have coffee with." Nia sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "You have a strong preference." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is perhaps the most restrained jealousy I have ever encountered." He said, "I'm trying." She started to laugh, quietly, and the tension came apart in her chest like a knot releasing. She said, "Thursday you can take me for coffee. Not as a replacement. As its own thing." He said, "Yes. Definitely yes." She said, "You're ridiculous." He said, and she could hear something in his voice that was closer to joy than she had yet heard from him. "Yes. I'm aware." Thursday arrived and he took her for coffee at a place in Yeonam-dong that had warm lighting and walls full of books and played Coltrane at exactly the right volume. He sat across from her and they talked for 2 hours and he was present in a way that made her feel, again, that she was the only information in the room. She noticed that he watched the door when it opened, and that he knew where all the exits were, and that his body was always positioned between her and the entrance. She noticed these things and filed them with all the other things she was accumulating about him that she had not yet organized into a conclusion. On the way out, his hand found the small of her back, light and confident, guiding her through the door, and she felt it like a key turning. She was falling. She knew it. She decided that evening to let herself fall. She had been so careful for so long. She was allowed this one extravagant, terrifying thing. What she did not know was that on that same Thursday evening in a building across the city, a meeting was taking place about her. Not about her specifically. About the question of her presence in Minho's life, which to certain people represented a variable they had not planned for and did not welcome. The Park family, who had been the Kang family's rivals in the quieter half of their operations for 2 decades, had been watching Minho with the particular attention of people waiting for a weakness to appear. They had not expected the weakness to arrive in the form of a Ghanaian graduate student on a scholarship, because they, like most people, had not been paying attention to the right things. But one of Park Sung-jin's people had been at the Celestial Hotel rooftop and had seen Minho talk to Nia for 47 minutes. And in the world where these men operated, attention was currency and 47 minutes was a fortune. Nia did not know any of this yet. She walked home from the coffee shop with Minho's hand warmth still registering somewhere in her nervous system, thinking about a thesis chapter and a man and the city lights and whether she had enough rice left in her dorm kitchen to make it through the weekend without shopping. She was practical even when falling. That was something he loved about her, though he had not yet said that word, not even to himself, using something that's specific and that irreversible. But he was close. He was very close to that word. He could feel it the way you feel a city before you arrive in it, in the quality of the air, in the way the light changes. The following week something changed. A photograph appeared in a social column of a Seoul lifestyle magazine, one of the kind that covered the movements of prominent families with breathless admiration and coded language. It was a photograph from the Celestial Hotel rooftop, pulled from someone's social media. It showed Minho and Nia at the railing. The caption read, Kang Minho, seen at Hanguk University's department celebration with an unidentified companion. A new development for the famously private heir? The photograph went through the department like fire through paper. By 9 a.m. Monday, every person in Nia's cohort had seen it. By 10 a.m., the commentary had organized itself into camps. The disbelieving, the jealous, and the hastily recalibrating. Haiwan, who had sent the invitation as a joke, who had written it would be interesting in looping ink, sat at her usual table in the campus cafe and did not say much, which for Haiwan was its own kind of statement. Nia arrived to her seminar and felt the change in the room before she saw any faces. She sat down, opened her laptop and looked at no one. She was not going to perform discomfort for people who had invited her to their party to amuse themselves. Dae-young slid into the seat next to her and said quietly, "You all right?" She said, "I'm fine." He said, "For what it's worth, you look exactly as unbothered as you're aiming for." She looked at him sideways and almost smiled. She said, "Is it convincing?" He said, "Mostly." She said, "Good enough." After the seminar, she stepped out of the building and found the black car at the curb and driver Shin standing beside it with his professional patience, and behind the car's rear window Minho. He stepped out when he saw her. He was wearing a dark coat and that same quality of controlled stillness, and he looked at her with an expression that contained both the photograph and the question of how she was and the willingness to do something about it if the answer was not good. She looked at him. She said, "Did you know about the photograph?" He said, "I was informed this morning." She said, "Is this going to be a thing? People looking at photographs of us?" He said carefully, "Possibly. I should have warned you sooner that my life is not private in the ways I'd prefer. I'm sorry for that." She looked at him for a moment. She was waiting for the part where he offered to manage it by making her less visible. The part where powerful men usually decided that the most practical solution was to tuck the inconvenient variable out of sight. He said, "I can't make them stop looking. But I can make sure they know exactly who you are when they look. If that's what you want." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I'd like to stop being quiet about this. About us. If you're willing." Nia Osei stood on the steps of her university building in a second-hand coat and her mother's gold earrings, with the city spreading out behind her and a man who could have chosen anyone standing in front of her asking not for her silence but for her presence, visible and named and fully herself. She said, "Let me think about it." He said, "Take as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. That was the third sign, and by now she had stopped arguing with the signs. The thinking did not take long. It took 4 days, which she spent in her usual way, studying, working her campus job, cooking the rice she had bought on the weekend, and running the conversation on a quiet loop in the back of her mind. What she was actually deciding was not whether she trusted him. She had already arrived at trust through a route that surprised her with its thoroughness. What she was deciding was whether she was prepared for what visibility meant. Whether she was ready to stand somewhere and be seen without the protection of anonymity. She called him on a Wednesday evening, which was outside their usual schedule. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Yes. Let's stop being quiet about it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She said, "I'm not changing anything about myself for anyone's comfort. Just so that's established." He said, "I would not ask that. Ever." She said, "Good." He said, "Nia." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're thanking me for agreeing to date you properly?" He said, "I'm thanking you for trusting me with something you've been protecting carefully." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't make me regret it." He said, "I will spend a considerable amount of time making sure you don't." He was true to this in ways both small and significant. He introduced her to his closest people with the directness of a man presenting a fact he was proud of. His younger brother Kang Minaseo, 24 and considerably less guarded than Minho, met Nia for lunch and spent 45 minutes talking about her published paper with the enthusiasm of someone who had actually read it and needed to discuss it, and by the end of the lunch was calling her Nuna with a warmth that made something complicated happen in Minho's expression, something that looked like relief and gratitude pressed together. His closest advisor, an older man named Chairman O who had been with the Kong family for 30 years, met Nia with polite formality and assessed her with the eyes of someone who has assessed many people and found most of them wanting. He said at the end of their meeting, "You're direct. Minho needs direct." He asked for that meeting himself, which she understood was its own form of recommendation. In the department, the recalibration was complete by the second week. People who had been cheerfully condescending to Nia Osei for 3 years now navigated her presence with a new and heightened attention. Haiwan approached her in the library and said, with the particular brightness of someone who has decided to act as if the past is a foreign country, "I just wanted to say, you look so happy lately. It suits you." Nia looked at her and said, "Thank you, Haiwan." She returned to her book. She was not cruel. She was not performing magnanimity. She simply understood that people who had underestimated her were going to have to carry that knowledge themselves, and she did not need to help them with it either way. What she focused on was the actual reality of being with Minho, which was extraordinary in ways she had not prepared herself for and would not have known to anticipate. He was attentive with a precision that should have been overwhelming but was not, because it never felt like surveillance. It felt like being known. He noticed that she got headaches when she read in low light and started sending her specific desk lamp recommendations with the same calm practicality he applied to everything. He noticed that she missed the heat of Ghana and started keeping an extra blanket in the car for her on cold evenings. He noticed that she had never been to the coast of Korea and arranged, one Saturday in late autumn, a drive to Incheon to stand by the water, just to stand there, with the sea wind moving through her hair and his hand warm around hers, saying nothing because nothing needed saying. She noticed things about him too. She noticed that he barely slept, that there were calls at 2 a.m. that he stepped away from her to take, that he carried a weight in his jaw and in his hands that only released fully when they were alone together. She noticed that he ate irregularly and that left to himself he would work through meals without blinking. She started, quietly, without announcement, making sure there was food available during their evening calls, not something elaborate, just real food at real intervals, and he received this without comment but with a quality of gratitude in his silence that said everything. They were building something. Both of them could feel the architecture of it taking shape, and both of them were moving carefully because the structure was precious and real and worth protecting. Then came the gala. It was a biannual event for a major charitable foundation with ties to several of Seoul's oldest families. Minho attended as a board member. He asked Nia to come with him, and this was different from the department party or the lecture or the restaurants. This was his world, formally in its full weight. This was the part of his life where the power lived in visible form, where the people who knew the other half of the Kong family's business would be present alongside the people who only knew the public half. She said yes. She understood what she was agreeing to. The dress this time was not secondhand. He asked if he could, and she considered his question and said, "Once. This once you can." He sent someone to her with 3 options and told her to choose based entirely on what she liked, not on anything else. She chose a dress the color of dark amber, with a fitted waist and a skirt that moved and a neckline that showed the architecture of her collarbones. She wore her mother's gold earrings again because those were not negotiable. He saw her in the lobby of her building and his expression did something that she was almost certain she would not have witnessed if he had been looking at anything less than something that undid him. He said, "You look." He stopped. She said, "I know." His mouth did something that was almost a real, full smile. He offered his arm. She took it. The gala was held at a venue near Gyeongbokgung, all high ceilings and quiet opulence. The moment they entered the room the calibration happened. People recognized him and then they recognized her, and then they recalibrated to process them as a unit. She felt this happening. She stood in it without flinching. He kept her close. Not in a way that crowded her, but in the way of a man who has assessed the room and made a decision about how it will treat her, and is positioned accordingly. When a woman in an impressive gown came to greet him and let her eyes slide over Nia with the specific aristocratic blindness of someone who has decided not to see, Minho said, "Please let me introduce Nia Osei. She is the most rigorous economic thinker in her cohort and also the person I care about most in this room." The woman's eyes refocused on Nia with some urgency. She heard him say the person I care about most in this room and filed it in a place where she kept the things that were too important to look at directly yet. It was later in the evening, during a moment when Minho had stepped away for a necessary conversation with a foundation board member, that Park Sung-jin found her. She did not know who he was immediately. She knew that he was around Minho's age and that his suit was as expensive and that his attention had a quality she had felt before in rooms where she was being assessed for some purpose she hadn't agreed to. He introduced himself with practiced warmth. Park Sung-jin, we haven't met. You're with Minho? She said, yes. He said, interesting choice on his part. He said it the way people say things that are intended to land in the gap between a compliment and an insult and claim the high ground of either depending on how they're received. She said, is it? He said, he's never brought anyone to something like this before. That means he's serious. He paused. Or that he's making a statement. Sometimes with Minho it's hard to know which. She said, I think you'll find they're not mutually exclusive. He studied her for a moment. The warmth in his expression cooled by a fraction, recalibrated, then returned at a different angle. You're very confident, he said. She said, I'm very clear. There's a difference. He was about to say something else when Minho appeared at her side. She had not seen him coming. He had simply arrived with that quality of presence that preceded him in rooms, and his hand found the small of her back and his gaze went to Park Sung-jin with an expression that was entirely pleasant and contained nothing pleasant in it. He said, Sung-jin, I see you've met Nia. Sung-jin said, we were getting acquainted. Minho said, wonderful. He smiled. Then he said something in Korean that Nia caught only the edge of, because she had been studying but was not yet fluent, but the effect was unmistakable. Sung-jin's expression shifted by several degrees and he excused himself within 30 seconds. She looked at Minho. She said, what did you say to him? He said, I told him that she is not someone you practice anything on. She looked at him for a moment. She said, you didn't need to. He said, I know. I wanted to. She said, is he dangerous? A pause, measured and intentional. Minho said, in certain contexts the Park family and mine have competing interests. Sung-jin specifically enjoys finding pressure points. He looked at her. You handled it perfectly. I just wanted him to understand the full landscape. She said, which is? He said, that you are not a pressure point. You are not a variable or a consideration or a leverage opportunity. He looked at her with complete directness. You are the thing I am protecting the whole landscape for. She looked at him and felt the word she had been refusing to say in her own interior for weeks rise up and press itself against the inside of her chest. She said, Minho. He said, yes. She said, I love you. He was still for a moment. Not a long moment. The kind of moment that is exactly as long as it needs to be. Then he said, with a quiet that held more than most people's loudness, I love you. I have been building to that sentence for months and it still doesn't feel large enough. She said, it doesn't need to be large. It needs to be true. He said, it's true. More than anything I've said to anyone. They stood in the middle of that expensive, complicated room, two people who had no business finding each other and had found each other anyway, and the city hummed outside the high windows and the chandeliers did their best to compete with the quality of light that was happening between them and failed. The weeks after the gala moved differently. The relationship settled into something that had both the ease of familiarity and the charge of something not yet fully arrived at. Minho's world opened to her further. She met more of his people, attended more of his events, and slowly, carefully, the two halves of his life stopped being two halves. She occupied both. She asked questions about the parts she didn't understand and he answered them with the same directness she had asked, which was the most intimate thing a man like him could do, to let someone see the full blueprint. She finished her thesis chapter. You read it? All of it? He sent her 3 pages of notes in careful English because he knew her Korean was still developing, and the notes were not flattering in the soft way of people who want to be liked. They were the notes of someone who had engaged seriously with the work and thought it deserved serious engagement. She read them twice and then called him and said, you actually understand the third variable argument. He said, I told you you were right about it. I understood it at the lecture. She said, why didn't you say so then? He said, you weren't asking for my opinion yet. I was waiting until you were. She said, Minho. He said, yes. She said, you are singularly infuriating and I am so in love with you. He said, the feeling is mutual. All of it. The proposal came on a night she did not expect, which was the only way he could have surprised her, because she had learned to read his preparations. It was a Tuesday, their phone call night, except he appeared at her building instead of calling, with driver Shin and without the usual text warning of his arrival. She opened her door in an oversized sweater and thesis notes stuck to her palm and looked at him standing in her doorway and said, it's a Tuesday. He said, I know. She said, you don't come on Tuesdays. He said, I'm adjusting the arrangement. He came inside. He looked at the desk lamp he had recommended, which she had bought. He looked at the protea petals she had kept in a small dish, dried and still holding their shape from the very first flowers. He looked at the thesis notes on the wall and the library books and the color-coded calendar and the bowl of rice on the stove and all the evidence of her life lived seriously and with intention in this small room. He said, "I want to marry you." She stopped moving. She said, "I'm standing in an oversized sweater with research notes on my hand." He said, "Yes." She said, "You couldn't have done this at the gala." He said, "I wanted to do it here. In your actual life. Not in mine." She looked at him and understood what he was offering. Not entry into his world, not absorption into his power and his wealth and his complicated empire. What he was offering was himself, choosing her life as the context in which he wanted to say the most serious thing he had ever said to anyone. She said, "Yes." He pulled a ring from his coat pocket, modest and specific, not performative, a deep warm gold that matched her earrings, and she understood that he had paid attention to the earrings for months. He slid it onto her finger and she looked at it and said, "You've been planning this." He said, "For some time." She said, "How long?" He said, "Since the night you told me you don't do borrowed time." That sentence. That was when I knew. She said, "That was 3 months ago." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. This man who had sent flowers and followed buses and paid attention to earrings and waited until she was ready and said things precisely when they were true and not a moment before. She said, "Kang Min-ho, you are the most careful, considered, extraordinary man I have ever met." He said, "You are the person I am most careful and considered for." She kissed him then, and the room held it, the small warm room with the desk lamp and the dried tortillas and the thesis notes and the borrowed heels from the first night still tucked under the bed, and it was entirely enough. It was, in fact, everything. The wedding was 6 months later, small and deliberate, because they were people who understood that the meaning of a thing is not measured by the number of witnesses but by the quality of the intention. Minicio cried at the ceremony, which he denied afterward with great energy. Chairman O gave a speech that was formal and brief and managed somehow to contain genuine warmth in every sentence. Driver Shin was there, in a suit rather than his uniform, and stood near the back where he could see all the exits, which made Nia smile. Her sister came from Accra and wore bright Kent and held Nia's hand before the ceremony and said, "You look like yourself. You look exactly like yourself." And Nia said, "Yes. I think that's the point." They were married on a Saturday in late spring with the city just waking up warm again and the light coming gold through the venue windows and Minho's hand steady around hers through the whole of it, the way it had been steady since the night he stood at the railing and said, "I'll find you again," like a fact. A year later, almost to the week, Nia sat in their apartment, which had been his and was now entirely theirs, with a desk lamp he had recommended on the table beside her and her thesis, completed and published, on the shelf, and a small image in her hand from a hospital appointment that morning. She looked at it for a long time. Then she called him. He answered on the second ring. She said, "You should come home." He said, "Is everything all right?" She said, "Everything is more than all right. Just come home." He was there in 20 minutes. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he came in. She held up the image. He looked at it and stopped in the doorway, and she watched something move through his face that was bigger than anything she had yet seen there, cracking through the precision and the control and the careful steadiness, opening into something raw and complete and entirely new. He crossed the room. He sat beside her. He took her hand and the image and held both and was quiet for a long moment in the way he was quiet when something mattered too much for immediate language. Then he said, "I'm going to need to adjust the whole arrangement again." She said, "Yes, you are." He said, "I'm ready." She looked at him. She said, "I know." And the city continued outside the windows, and the desk lamp held its steady circle of light, and Nia Osei, who had arrived to a party as a joke, who had learned every warm library corner and every discounted vending machine and every trick of surviving on not enough, sat in the life she had built with the man who had found her at a railing and stayed, and it was extraordinary. Not because it was without difficulty, because it was not. Not because it was uncomplicated, because it was not that either. It was extraordinary because it was true. Every part of it was true. And they had chosen each other into it, deliberately, completely, without reservation. That was everything. That was, in the end, more than enough.